Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was a gamer between dimensions. When a boy wakes up in the world of Naruto with no memory of the past, foggy memories of the future, and a convenient gamer-like ability, so what's he to do? The only option is to get stronger and move forward. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard! Chapter 16. Gamer's Body. It was my unique innate ability that was the main reason for my rapid growth and accelerated healing factor. However, that was not all. What made this ability unique was that every injury my body took was converted to some level of damage regardless of where I was attacked. My HP was just a measuring tool that denoted how much punishment I could take before my body could no longer support itself or regenerate. I figured that factors such as the strength behind the attack, the amount of energy contained within the attack, and a few other things were what contributed to the levels of damage I took. Normal human weak points like my heart and lungs did not seem to really factor into how much damage an attack could inflict upon me, or at the very least, they didn't factor in too much. But then that really begged the question. What exactly was I? We're getting close to the land of lightning. We'll hang around there for a bit before making our way back home. Dove? Lion asked. My teacher focused for a moment before nodding. A couple of the clones I left behind sensed them heading our way. I think we've got them hooked. Good, he said before signaling us to stop. We have about half an hour ahead of IWA, and with our traps a little more than that. We'll stop here for a moment. Catch your breath and tend to your wounds. He ended before glancing at me for a moment. I sighed and dropped to the ground as the rest of the Umbu did so as well. I could sense that most of them were exhausted. I could see that a good majority were injured. And I knew that there was less Umbu here now than what we had started with. As team captain, it is a necessity that I know the capabilities of each member of my squad so that I can draft the most optimal plan for any mission. Lion began as he stood across from me, arms crossed. Lion. Boar began as he walked beside him. What is the meaning of this? Panther, the last of the three squad captains, stood to the side and looked at Lion questioningly. Some of the Umbu were just sitting around. Others were treating their wounds. All of them were definitely paying attention to what was going on here. Lion looked at me. That is a question I would like to ask him. What the hell happened during the battle with the Jinchuriki? With the 4 violet flames formation up, the only possible way you could have vanished like that was if you used some kind of space-time technique. Startlement and surprise were the emotions I felt emanating from the surrounding Umbu, though they hid them perfectly as they continued to act as if they hadn't heard anything. I could understand the surprise. After all, creating or mastering a spacetime technique was quite a huge deal. These techniques represented more avenues to piece through enemy lines and catch them defenseless. They were feared as well. If someone would just teleport past all your traps, guards, and defenses and kill you, wouldn't you just die with injustice? Finally, they were hard to learn and even harder to create. Very hard. If I had been briefed about the fact that you could vanish with the enemy like that, I could have planned a more appropriate course of action that would have reduced the amount casualties on our end. Lion explained, his irritation slightly rising. It's understandable that you wouldn't want your technique to be known. However, you should know that you wouldn't have had to worry about it being spread or talked about, yet you withheld something that could have helped us immensely. I looked down and bit my lip. What he was saying was completely truthful. With Danzo's cursed tongue eradication seal on everyone's tongue, no one would have been able to speak of my ability to unauthorized personnel. The chances of it leaking would have been astronomically small, especially considering that I was in the root division of Konoha Umbu. The people here would suffer through the worst torture in order to keep information about our village confidential. Danzo took a lot of steps to ensure the least secrecy. I understood that. Yet, I kept this ability of mine a secret even though many more of our shinobi could have been saved if I had made either the Hokage and or Danzo aware of my ability. Was it wrong of me to have kept it hidden? I severely doubted that anyone would have been able to replicate it, and even if they could, ID create was still spacetime ninjutsu of sorts, which meant that it should be difficult to learn. Besides that, this technique wasn't something I was particularly afraid of being known for. After all, Minato's flying Raijin was arguably just as frightening as he could easily implant his seal formula on an enemy shinobi and teleport to them right in the center of their village. Granted, the other villages probably screened their shinobi for something like that since Minato's flying Raijin was quite well known, but what could they really do to stop him from teleporting everywhere? What would anyone has been able to do to me if they found out about ID? It was not like the other villages had a few ninjutsu masters skilled enough to place a spacetime blockade around their village. The best case scenario, if I had told the Hokage or Danzo about my ability, would have been that no one outside of authorized and trusted individuals would ever find out about it and the fact that I have it. The worst case scenario would be that the entire shinobi world learns about my ID create skill and plasters my head with the highest bounty imaginable in fear of me assassinating them. With my empathy and energy resonance, even if I was caught in a trap, I would see it from kilometers away and would be able to use that very skill to run away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I really didn't have a reason not to have told Hiruzen at the very least. We could have used my ID, traveled to the heart of the camp, left my ID, assassinated Rashi before he could wake up, and that would have been it. It might not have been that easy, but the casualties would undoubtedly have been much less. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do to change what had already happened. I have no excuses. Lion looked at me for a moment and took a deep breath. What has happened has already happened and cannot be changed even with spacetime ninjutsu, he said, before asking. At the very least, did you complete the mission? I nodded my head and gently thrust my hand forward, ripples appearing in space as my hand went inside my inventory. I ignored the surprise since, at this point, I didn't care if they saw me use my inventory. If anything, I would just say that this and the ID were the same skill. It's not like inventory was revolutionary, as this place already had things like seal scrolls which, while not as good, worked well enough. With that done, I tossed the scroll to Lion, who deftly caught it with one hand. He opened it, ran his chakra through the scroll before in a puff, Rashi's head appeared. After confirming that it was the real deal, he put the head back into the storage scroll. At least you completed the objective, he said while keeping the scroll on his person. He looked and nodded at both Panther and Boar before looking at the surrounding Umbu. We don't want to loiter here too long or else we will have to deal with Kumo as well. Rest up for one more minute, then we'll get a move on. His piece said, he walked away. Panther followed suit after glancing my way for a moment. Boar nodded at me before going to do his own thing. And then, it was just me. I couldn't help the sigh that escaped my lips as I turned around and walked towards my teacher, who was leaning against a tree, looking at me with a serious countenance. I stopped in front of her and wondered what I should. My head whipped to the side as a stinging sensation appeared on my cheek. I blinked. Ow. That was for disobeying my orders and almost getting yourself killed in the process, she said. I rubbed my cheek, idly wondering what she would have done if she found out that I had actually died. She kneeled down to my eye level and removed my hand from my cheek before leaning forward and placing her lips against it. That was for coming back safely. Maybe I should do stupidly suicidal things more often. I'm sorry for worrying you, I said. I just didn't want to risk anything happening to you. She sighed and ran her fingers through my hair. And I don't want anything to happen to you. Promise me, she said as she placed her hands on either side of my cheeks and forced me to look at her. That you won't carelessly risk your life like that. I'll try. She narrowed her eyes and pinched my cheeks. Really hard. Ow, it hurts, please stop. She huffed and let go of me before stating, put on some clothes at the very least. You shouldn't be walking around so exposed. We're about to leave. I blinked and looked down, noting that I was practically naked. The only reason I didn't notice this earlier was because I was used to using henge for my clothing. The technique in and of itself allowed me to copy the appearance of another person, including their height and clothing, so it was simple to just form clothing on my body. Of course, said clothing had practically no defensive purposes and required a constant input of chakra to maintain, and therefore they felt like air. Anyways, I simply utilized my inventory to instant equip some more of my Umbu gear. Yep, I could do that. My teacher raised a brow at me. How did you? Spacetime ninjutsu. She looked at me blankly for a moment before looking away and commenting, "You're bullshit." Language. I was flicked in the head. Hard. Why? Alright, let's continue moving. Lion stated as he stood up, the rest of us following suit. The path we took led us into the Land of Lightning's territory, where we slowly began to remove our chakra trails before turning around and heading back towards the southwest direction where Konoha was. With my teacher's help, we were able to avoid enemy detection quite easily and made it back home with few complications. It was past midnight by the time we arrived and used one of our many hidden entrances throughout the village. It took a relatively short period of time for us to eventually meet with Danzo, who awaited there quietly. Lion stepped up, along with Boar and Panther, with the scroll in hand. Before speaking, our mission was a success. The enemy was on our trail till we arrived at Kumo before we hid them and returned back. Saying so, he passed it to Danzo. Danzo turned his lone eye to the scroll and picked it up before nodding his head. You've all done well. With your success, you all have paved a path towards Konoha's victory in this war. With this, your work is complete. You're all dismissed. Yes, Lord Danzo. With that, the Umbu split up to go their separate ways. Lion, however, stayed back and whispered to Danzo about my skill, which I could hear perfectly with my enhanced hearing. For a moment he motioned in my direction, Danzo following his line of sight and nodding. With that, Lion bowed and vanished. Tisk, snitch. Squirrel. Danzo called. Before I moved forward, I felt Koto place a hand on my head and rub it before she vanished. I walked towards the bandaged man and stood in front of him. His eye stared down at me expressionlessly. What do you have to say for yourself? I have no excuse. I replied with my head kept down. We stayed in silence. There's no need for you to stand on ceremony, Danzo said, causing me to look up. Your mystical healing has saved the village from countless casualties and has increased our force by over 1,000 from the restoration of the previously handicapped shinobi, Danzo said as he looked at me. You have already given more than what this village could ask for with no rewards. All I want to know is if that skill is transferable. I blinked in subtle shock at his words, as I had thought he would have made me spill. Only a moment later did the words he had asked fully register, and I replied, it's an innate ability. I suppose it could be counted at a Kekkai Genkai. After all, I've been able to do this for as long as I could remember. Lie successful. Successful. What was I supposed to say? That a higher dimensional being decided to give me a book that taught me how to create pocket dimensions? I didn't quite think something like that would sit well. Besides, I sincerely doubted I could teach someone ID create, since I myself didn't know how it fully worked even though I could use it, so by that definition, it was kind of like an innate ability. It wasn't a complete lie. Danzo nodded at my words, seemingly satisfied and relieved. Then that's fine, he said before asking. To be truthful, for the amount you have benefited the village, I feel that it is only right that you get something for your dedication. Speak if you have something in mind. I closed my eyes. To be honest, I actually did want something, and it had been something that had been on my mind for a long period of time now. I kind of wanted to leave Root. I'd been here for years already, and while I gained a lot of experience as a shinobi, and in addition to harsh training I most likely wouldn't have received in the academy, I just wasn't keen on being here anymore. It wasn't that I had become afraid of Root or anything. Gamer's mind wouldn't let me, but I was just a bit fed up with the constant missions I had been sent to. I wanted a little more time to myself and to the few people I cared about. Root would suck away that time easily. I still wanted to be a shinobi, though, since that was the only way I would be able to make money. Well, not the only way, as I could sell fuinjutsu pieces, but it was the best way for me. However, I didn't want to leave my teacher behind. If I hadn't been around, even if she didn't die, she would have been severely wounded, and while thanks to my mystical healing such a thing wasn't a huge deal, I would prefer it never occurred in the first place. I doubted, however, that Danzo would let her go since she was an extremely adept censor. I just wanted to keep her in as little trouble as possible. Excuse my request if it is too excessive. I began. Danzo looked at me with a raised brow and motioned for me to continue. I would like to be relieved of my duties en route. I began before quickly elaborating. I will still be a shinobi of the village and will still go on missions that are asked of me, but I want the option to decline them. Additionally, I'd like to take up my own missions if possible. Doable. Danzo said. However, you must accept at least 75% of the missions that you otherwise would have done as a root shinobi. This was probably the best deal I could get, and it worked fine by me. As long as I could say no to fighting another Jinchuriki, I was perfectly fine. So, I nodded. But I didn't leave immediately. Danzo narrowed his eyes, however, as I stayed rooted in place. Speak, what else is on your mind? I paused and contemplated my words before sighing. During this mission, my teacher almost died. I understand that it is a shinobi's duty to die for their village. I personally wasn't quite keen on doing that though, but I digress. But she is a great asset to the village, and sending her in such a perilous mission in the future would be detrimental to us if we lost her. Another round of silence. Then, what are you suggesting? Danzo asked slowly. I paused for a moment before replying. I hope that you provide her with missions that don't involve fighting individuals on the levels of Jinchuriki. Additionally, I would like to be notified of any mission you give her so that I might partake in it. If I wasn't going to be en route anymore, then I obviously wouldn't be on my teacher's team and therefore would get every mission she did. With this, I could do what I could to keep her safe. It may seem stalkerish, but I had slept in the same bed with her for over 4 years. This was nothing. Even if you hadn't asked. Danzo began. I would have done so. The situation at Canopy Bridge would have been very dangerous if the four-tailed Jinchuriki had entered the fray. Danzo explained. I had gathered all of my available force just to make that threat a non-issue. Canopy Bridge needed to be destroyed, or this war would drag on longer than necessary. I truly would have preferred not to place her in this situation, as her skills are invaluable. However, I had to do whatever was necessary and use all my troops. Oh. Well, at least I didn't have to worry too much. Then, I suddenly blinked in shock as I looked up at Danzo. I wasn't sure if I was able to keep my surprise in check. He was smiling. Danzo was smiling. This was the second time I had ever seen him display a fragment of emotion, and it was truly weird. Those young women found a good seed. Danzo whispered with a smile before looking my way and tapping his cane on the ground. Your requests are reasonable and I have considered them. You're dismissed. Before I could even say anything else, he vanished in a swirl of leaves. I really couldn't understand him. With that, I too used that technique to vanish from my spot and appear in front of the door to my teacher's apartment. Before I even knocked on the door. Come in, Yoru. Censor and all that. I opened the door to see my teacher laying on the couch in her living room and closed it behind me. What brings you all the way over here? She asked as she stretched her limbs. I live next door. Legitimately right across the hall from her. She blinked. Oh yeah, that's right. She then chuckled. Is that it though? I shook my head. I left route. She froze. Of course, as I'm now a freelance shinobi of the leaf, I have the option of picking my own missions. Additionally, I'll still go on all the missions you go on. I'll still be by your side. She looked at me for a moment before motioning for me to come forward, to which I obliged. Suddenly, I felt her grip my wrist tightly before she pulled me into her embrace. It's already late, she said as she lay on the couch, still holding on to me tightly. So, I'm going to sleep. She didn't leave room for argument as she closed her eyes. I blinked. Well, at least her chest is comfortable. I sighed and internally shook my head. I took a deep breath and focused within myself. With that, my eyes closed as I drifted off. I slowly opened my eyes only to witness darkness around me. The only visible light source was the tree constellation in the distance, made up of green stars or crystals, which glowed in an intricate pattern reminiscent of the foliage of an ash tree. I looked below the foliage and noted that the tree constellation had a trunk and roots which glowed like a galaxy. Additionally, in the center of the tree's trunk was a hole so dark it seemed to devour everything around it, yet it was contained within the tree. And then I felt a pull. My eyes hardened as my body was yanked away from its previous position and pulled towards the gaping hole of the tree. The green stars suddenly elongated before vanishing behind me as if I had traveled at warp speeds. Before I could contemplate any further, the black hole appeared closer in front of me before it encompassed my view. I blinked once as I adjusted to the sudden addition of light before my eyes widened. It was as if I was in a whole new world. Around me were an innumerable amount of blue screens, each depicting rows and rows of complicated code. I couldn't even begin to understand what was being written on them, but I could absolutely understand that this was the work of immense brilliance. Why, thank you. That voice. I turned around. In front of my view was a man who had definitely not been here just a moment prior. He looked exactly like I did, silver hair, brown skin, similar height. The only difference was in our eyes was that while mine were silver, his were golden and vertically slitted as before. My doppelganger pointed behind me. Why don't you take a seat? I blinked and turned around, now noticing a chair which had definitely not been behind me before. That being said, I still sat down with my twin following suit as a chair suddenly appeared behind him. I know you have plenty to ask me, he stated. I'll try to ignore your mind while you ask questions, so don't hold back. Do note though that there are a few things that you won't understand even if I told them to you. Where did I even start? There was so much I wanted to ask him about ever since I had met him all those years ago. I paused before asking the most relevant question to mind. Who or what are you really? I'm a snake, he said. I blinked. What? You asked me what I was and I told you. How? I stopped and looked at him carefully. What? My intelligence was definitely showing. My counterpart chuckled. I only appear this way because you wouldn't even be able to comprehend my true form, just as you cannot comprehend a 4-, 5-, 6-, etc. Dimensional existence. Of course, I exist outside the concept of dimensional planes, so that's a moot point. Oh. He began. I also like to eat what you would call universes. Though there are higher tiers of them, such as multiverses and hyperverses. I prefer to eat hyperverses though. Hyperverses? Ah, they are multiverses in the general term, but I call them that because they are 12-dimensional realities and above. I like the infinite dimensional ones though, they have a variety of flavor. Don't worry though, I won't eat your world and I don't plan on eating for some time. I actually haven't eaten in a... He paused in thought for a moment. Actually, the concept of time is irrelevant to me, so I couldn't really explain to you how long, let's just say a really long time. I decided that for the sake of my mental health, I'd simply try not to think about this past minute too much. So, I asked a different question. What am I? He paused and thought for a moment as if wondering how to word his answer. The simplest answer would be that you're human in all the ways that matter. All the ways that matter? I asked back. I'll put it this way, what exactly makes a human a human? Is it their genome? Then what about those with large genetic mutations? Is it their looks? Then what if an alien looked exactly like a human? Is it a status you are simply born with? Then what about the very first humans? Were they not simply a product of evolution from the first unicellular microbe till now? Are they not also humans? When did the term human apply to humans? I took in his words. I could somewhat understand what he was trying to explain to me. You can be considered a different breed of human, but at the same time, you simply cannot be classified as such. You are better in every way with potential that can allow you to reach unfathomable heights. I stayed silent at that and closed my eyes for a moment. I see. I didn't feel any different from knowing this. But at least I knew. What exactly is my purpose then? Why the gamer ability? Why do I even exist? He hummed. Well, that's up to you, isn't it? The gamer is simply a tool to help you track your progress throughout your journey and of course to help you stay alive. He leaned back into his chair before continuing. If you want your life to have some meaning, well, it'll be up to you to find it. That told me absolutely nothing. He simply smiled. I opened my eyes and focused on the other things that had caught my attention and asked the second most prominent thing in mind. What is that tree outside? Those green stars that make up the foliage, what exactly are they? Jay snapped his fingers in reply, causing a large screen to appear in front of us. Depicted on it was the complete view of the tree. The green glowing stars made up its foliage and were akin to its leaves, while its trunk and branches glittered with small white lights similar to those of a galaxy. The Tree of Genesis. I blinked. That name meant absolutely nothing to me. Jay explained. It was here before the concept of space and time existed and will be here till the concept of eternity ceases to exist. I really couldn't comprehend what that meant about the tree, but I nodded nonetheless. I see, and what does it do? Suddenly, the picture of the screen magnified towards the glowing stars, which were, in fact, the crystals that hung off the tree which acted as leaves. Suddenly, the screen stopped zooming as it focused on one crystal in particular. The glittering green crystal depicted a scene I was quite familiar with. 18 individuals, and 3 cats, were holding their hands in a circle, and above them towered a large dark dragon. The beast's wings unfurled before it took a deep breath, energy coalescing within its gaping maw. With nothing to stop it, it unleashed a breath of immense power towards the individuals, obliterating the island they were on. That is one of the infinite worlds that the tree contains. Jay explained as he looked back towards me. Every concept of fiction is contained on the branches of the tree as leaves or those crystals. Each one depicts entire worlds and stories. What? Every world and story that has ever been conceptualized exists within the tree. It contains an infinite number of infinitely layered worlds with infinite possibilities and impossibilities. It is a boundless existence, and all that you truly see of the tree is only the surface of what your mind is able to comprehend. I literally could not understand that, so I opted to simply nod at his explanation. Once in a while, I snack on a few of its leaves though. Does that make me vegetarian? Wait. Don't other people exist in those worlds? Doesn't that mean? Jay tilted his head at me. Do you know how many microbes are on the apples you eat? Do you care? I paused. So to him, living creatures were mere microbes. Yes and no. He replied. I thought you weren't going to read my thoughts. I can read your thoughts whether I want to or not, and I wanted to correct you. He replied. The only living creatures that exist as microbes in my eyes are hyperverse level beings or those of Tier 1b. Any creature below that is non-existent to me. Wait, Tier 1b? What type of individual would you have to be see Tier 1b individuals as nothing more than microbes? I couldn't even comprehend how strong you would have to be. Minato was around 6C, which meant he would level islands with his strength. What could someone above 1B do? At that moment, Jay raised up his hands before a display appeared in front of him. I can only tell you and not show you, after all, it would be too dangerous otherwise. Tier 1A. Level, irrelevant. AP, outerversal. SPD, irrelevant. STR, outerversal. SS, irrelevant. DUR, outerversal. INT, incalculable. What? What did that even mean? Now as I was explaining. Jay continued, swiping the screen away and ignoring my dumbfoundedness. Any creature below 1B is non-existent to me, but of course there are some exceptions. Individuals who have created their own multiverse that are intertwined with the tree have my attention, which usually means those of Tier 2C and above might barely register as existing beings in my eyes. Only if they decide to intertwine their world with the tree, of course. Was he not going to explain what his status mean? What the hell was outerversal? And an irrelevant level? Of course, you're also the other exception. I looked at him blankly. I'm filled with joy. Now back on the topic of the various worlds, I would caution you to be wary. He continued in a tone of severity, one which I hadn't expected to come from him. There are a very, very small amount of creatures/beings who transcend the concept of dimensions and exist beyond all time and space and could be considered boundless. They are the lords of their own fictional realities which are intertwined with the tree but are not an actual part of it. They are neither good nor bad, nor do they care about beings who still exist within the concept of dimensional planes, but you will not want to meet them regardless. If I was to rate them, they would be Tier 0. I could put up a fight with the help of the tree, but then we'd probably destroy every concept of reality. My heart nearly stopped at that. I took a deep breath and rubbed my temples, gamer's mind allowing me to function at near optimal cognitive capacity. I decided that I really didn't want to know anymore, so I focused on something else than those worlds. Could I somehow go there? Of course, you can. He replied. As long as you reach level 100, you'll have an opportunity to visit those worlds. Ping. Quest alert. To infinity and beyond. The worlds on the Tree of Origin are vast and boundless with infinite possibilities and impossibilities. There is so much to explore and see, but you have to earn that chance. Reach level 100. Reward, system update. Failure, the only way you could possibly fail is if you died. The only option was for me to accept. So, I did. I looked down and thought. Another question had suddenly surfaced in my mind. When I first accessed this place years ago, I saw a crystal of my homeworld, but in it depicted the Ninetales rampage. What was that about? Was it the past or future? What would have happened if I had touched that screen? Alternate reality. I perked up. My lookalike continued to explain. Every branch of the tree contains innumerable crystal leaves which represent alternate realities of an original world. The closer the leaves are to the tip of the branch, the more similar they are to the original world. Each branch represents the connection between these similar worlds or alternate realities. So that world I had seen was simply an alternate reality. The crystal it had been shown on was huge, so it must have been a work very close to, if not actually being, the original. It made me wonder what had happened in that world, but there was nothing I could really do, so I didn't dwell on it. This place though. These worlds had new things. People. Places. Stories. One day when I was ready, I would explore them and find something worthwhile for myself. There was simply so much new and overwhelming information. A tree that contained an infinite number of higher dimensional and lower dimensional worlds? Branches that contained alternate realities of a singular world? A crystal that contained a world? And all of this I could simply access whenever? I closed my eyes and sighed. This entire journey, this entire trip here, the time I spent in this place, it gave me a lot to think about. Thank you, I said as I stood up and bowed. There were a few more things that I wanted to ask him about, but with the amount of information I had just received, I felt like I needed to digest it for a moment. There were an infinite number of worlds. Infinite possibilities. How do I leave? I suddenly asked. In the past, I had usually been yanked out either because Jay had kicked me out or because I hadn't leveled up meditation to level 100 and simply haven't been ready to stay here for a prolonged period. Now, however, it seemed like I could. Just think it, he replied. I nodded and closed my eyes in concentration. I focused on escaping this place, and in but a moment, I felt a hard tug. My body was yanked away from its position at immense speeds as I suddenly exited the tree and flew back far enough that I could see the entirety of its outline. My body was hurtled through the dark void of my inner soul. Congratulations! Meditation has leveled up by 1. Meditation, active, LVL 100 max. Passively increase INT by 200%. Passively increase WIS by 200%. Passively increase ENGY by 200%. HP and CP regeneration increase by 1000% when active. I slowly opened my eyes. My teacher was already gone and I was there alone on the couch with a blanket covering me. I turned to the side and found a note on the living room table which I promptly opened. I scanned it, realizing that Koto had decided to take the day off and go to the orphanage. I folded it up and removed the blanket before walking outside my teacher's apartment. My gaze turned ahead, noting that the sun was high in the sky and judging from its position, it was pretty early in the day. My gaze then turned downward, my visual senses noticing that the streets below were covered by a thick blanket of snow. I could see little children frolicking around, oblivious to the notion that they could become sick by playing in such a frigid environment. I narrowed my eyes and thought. What could I do today? Usually, when I wasn't on a mission I would train with my restriction seals, or in my ID, or try to come up with a new Fuinjutsu project to work on. Speaking of Fuinjutsu, I can work on Amanoto Kotachi later on. Before any of that, however. What is it, mouse? A figure landed next to me. Lord Hokage has informed me that Lady Tsunade has requested to meet you at Konoha Hospital. I turned to face him before nodding. I see. I'll be there in a minute. Mouse nodded before vanishing in a burst of speed. Well, it looks like I found something to do for a little while. With that thought, I concentrated for a moment before using the body flicker to suddenly appear in front of Konoha Hospital. I felt for Tsunade's chakra for a moment before I quickly found her. The security of this place was very severe, mainly due to the war, but also because of the Fuinjutsu seal I had manufactured some time ago. As a result, as soon as I showed the guards my identification, I was immediately let in. The ability to restore limbs and heal all wounds to their prime? All the other villages would probably start focusing on Konoha, more specifically, our hospital and medical staff. There was already word spreading about my seal, which was to be expected. Who knew how many people had suddenly regrown their limbs? And who knew how many low-key spies were around the village? The other villages definitely knew about us, however. Sand was our ally and Water Country was going through some tough times ever since that mission I had gone on some time ago. That only left the Hidden Stone Village and Lightning Country. With the success of yesterday's mission, IWA would no doubt begin to slowly put pressure on Lightning. Additionally, if we were able to cut off their supply line at Canopy Bridge, Konoha would secure its victory over IWA. Lightning always had some sort of beef with Konoha and took any chance they could to harass us, but if IWA began to put pressure on them, we wouldn't have to worry too much on that front. With those thoughts, I arrived in front of a guarded door to what led to one of the much larger rooms of Konoha Hospital. I once again flashed my identification, which allowed me access to the room. The first First thing I noticed as I stepped inside the room was a large, highly complex, four-cornered Fuinjutsu inscription on the floor. At each corner were two medical ninjas, one of which sat on the point of the four-cornered seal and the other stood behind them. At the center of the seal lay a broken and severely bruised form of a man, while at the head of the seal sat a young woman who seemed to be leading the operation. I carefully looked at all four corners of the square seal before narrowing my eyes as I noticed a young girl, no older than 12 to 13, sitting on one of the corners. She was a fair-skinned girl of average height for her age and slender build. She had onyx eyes and straight, shoulder-length, jet-black hair with bangs that covered her ears and framed her face. I watched as she worked, while also not slowing down the other medical ninja as they worked meticulously to stabilize the injured individual who was in the center of the formation. I could feel her precise control over her chakra as she steadily inputted it into the seal, while also matching the rates of input of the other medical ninja. "What do you think of her?" Tsunade asked beside me. I leaned against the wall of the room while slipping my hands in my pockets. "What is going on here?" Tsunade looked at me for a moment before returning her gaze back towards the proceedings. "That square formation dash. I'm aware of what it is," I replied before she could finish. "What I'm curious about is why you are using the healing resuscitation regeneration technique when I've already provided mystical healing." The healing resuscitation regeneration technique. I had taken no small amount of influence from it when creating my own technique. Tsunade scoffed. This was how severe and often debilitating wounds used to be healed, but more importantly, it required precise chakra control and teamwork between the medical ninja involved. So far I had only chosen medical ninja whose control and overall capabilities had allowed them to execute this technique to perfection. I nodded in understanding. "So, you are testing to see if that little girl has the skill necessary for my technique? What happens if she makes a mistake?" She looked at me in amusement. "You speak as if you're much older than her." Saying so, she returned her gaze back ahead. "I believe my apprentice is sufficiently prepared, and I have sufficient confidence in her that I know she won't make a mistake. If she does, however, I am right here to make sure everything goes smoothly." I nodded before continuing to focus on the healing ahead. I watched as the injured shinobi's wounds were ever so slowly closing. The missing sections of his body were being filled with an agglomeration of his own cells as they were perfectly replicated and fixed into his wounds. I paid careful attention to the girl's chakra flow as she contributed to the formation. It was steady with very little fluctuation, though it was not perfect. If I had to say, I would a CC rating of around 88 to 90%. After a long period of time with the medical shinobi switching in and out of the rotation, the man's wounds eventually became fully closed. "All right, you've all done well," Tsunade stated as the medics panted from exhaustion. The lead nurse slightly inclined her head. "Thank you, Lady Tsunade." She then paused before looking at me. "This is your evaluator," Tsunade replied with a smile. I blinked. "Evaluator? Evaluator?" the head nurse asked in confusion. "Exactly," Tsunade replied before looking at me. "He's an extremely adept sensor and can give you an accurate percentage level of your chakra control. That's incredible," the woman replied with the other medic behind her shadowing her wonder. "Ah, so that's what she wants." Whenever Tsunade had first introduced me to the medical ninja that she had picked out to obtain my seal, I had utilized my sensing capabilities to gauge their level of control. My chakra sensing capabilities were quite unique in that while they currently had a much shorter range than my teachers, they allowed me to glean much more information about the energy flow of individuals in general. I nodded my head at Tsunade before concentrating for a moment. While I hadn't been paying explicit attention to their chakra as they were doing the procedure, I had still felt and remembered how it flowed. I looked at all 9 medical ninjas who had participated in the procedure before looking at the head nurse. 90%. She blinked. "I suppose that's good?" "Very," I replied. "Your control is phenomenal." She smiled heartedly before I moved on to the next individual. 88%. The man blinked. Is that very much above average? You have good control. He bowed before I moved on again. 88%. And again. 87%. And again. 87%. And again. 89%. And continued on. 87%. 88%. Before I stopped at the last individual, the young girl that Tsunade had wanted me to look after. She looked at me straight in the eyes with no visible trace of hesitation before she suddenly blushed and looked down. I was beginning to think that my charms mainly worked on people my age. Either that or I had been hanging around people who were either too used to my adorable visage and or were seasoned killers who weren't too easily swayed. Wait, what was I thinking? I internally shook my head. Your name? She blinked at my sudden question before straightening up. As Shizune. I nodded. 89%. Your control is very high. By the way, Tsunade had around 95% control. Her eyes widened before she cheerfully nodded. Thank you. I looked back at Tsunade, who clapped her. All right everyone, take a break. I'll take over from here. Thank you, Lady Tsunade. They chorused before leaving the room. Except for you, Shizune. The blonde called out. Shizune paused before heading back and stood next to her teacher. Yes, Lady Tsunade? The older woman smiled and placed a hand on the younger girl's shoulder before looking my way. Don't you think she's qualified? Shizune looked between me and Tsunade in confusion before her eyes widened and she suddenly flushed. Lady Tsunade, I'm still very young. That's not what I meant. Tsunade exclaimed. Geez, what goes on through your mind? Shizune blushed heatedly before shaking her head and asking. Then what? You want me to give my seal to her? I asked as I looked carefully at Shizune. I suppose she has enough control, but is she really qualified to know about its origin? Humph, of course she is. Who do you think I am? The Sannin asked rhetorically. She's my apprentice and a loyal shinobi. As long as I say it, she's qualified. I raised a brow. Whatever you say, but any consequences that arise from this will be shouldered by you. She simply waved me off. Whatever, the old man will understand. Just do it already. I shrugged and stepped forward towards Shizune before asking, tell me, what type of design do you want? Something inconspicuous like Lady Tsunade's diamond or something more colorful. Shizune blinked multiple times before looking back and forth between me and Tsunade. I don't really understand what's going on. My sudden ability to regrow limbs and heal the most debilitating injuries. Tsunade began as she looked towards her apprentice. Where do you think I obtained it? Of course, you developed it on your own. Shizune started with utmost confidence. You're well regarded as the world's best medical ninja. Who else but you could develop such a unique medical technique? Wait. Are you about to teach it to me? She concluded with stars in her eyes. Tsunade's eye twitched as her cheeks turned slightly crimson from embarrassment before she turned her head away. I didn't develop it, he did. She finished, pointing at me. Shizune's eyes widened dramatically. What? How could that be? She looked back and forth between Tsunade's embarrassed face and my annoyed one. He's younger than me. How could he possibly come up with such a thing? Seals. I said simply. I have a formula that does something that I don't feel like explaining. All you need to know is that when you activate it while using the Mystic Palm technique, you'll regrow limbs. Now what design do you want and where? It seemed like all the reverie she had suddenly evaporated as she just stood there dully. Just give her a flower or something and place it on her thighs, Tsunade suggested. May I ask why the design and placement choice? Tsunade rubbed her chin. I think it will give her some charm for when she grows older. I raised both my brows and decided that I quite honestly didn't care. I turned back towards Shizune, who was still deflated, and poked her right thigh with my index finger before inscribing the seal on it. Countless lines of script appeared on her body before they coalesced at my finger and formed an intricate flower design. There, all set. Shizune awoke from her stupor and looked at her thigh before pausing. It looks good. You're welcome. I replied before looking back at Tsunade. Well, is there anything else you need from me? Nothing much really. Tsunade said with a shrug, feel free to go anytime. I'll call you when I need you. I rolled my eyes and made to leave. Women. Wait. Shizune yelled, stopping me in my tracks. What's your name? I turned back towards her. Yoru. She said my name a couple of times to herself before she nodded with a smile and blushed. Alright then, Yoru. Thank you. I nodded and walked back outside before exiting the building. Now, the next thing on my list was to collect Rashi's bounty, so I sent a clone out to do just that for me. Now I really have nothing to do. I thought as I rubbed my chin. I suppose I can start working on my other project. With that thought, I looked around for a moment before shaking my head and deciding to body flicker to the training grounds. With that, I simply thought to myself. ID create, empty. A bubble began to spread around me before encompassing the area I was in. The sky turned red, the wind stopped blowing, and the sound all but disappeared as the instant dungeon fully formed. Now then, it's time for experiments. I created a few clones to help me with said experiments as I focused on myself. I felt the flow of my chakra and its many different natures before I opened the palm of my hand. Balls of fire, lightning, earth, water, and wind floated on the palm of my hands in a circle. I had absolutely perfect control of my chakra and its natures. As I mixed my water and wind natures, a chill filled the air. Ice release. Next, I combined fire and earth, a smoldering heat emanating from my hands as a ball of lava floated on my palms. Lava release. I could also get boil release and scorch release if I wanted. There was one other Kekii Genkai I had been trying to replicate, though a frown marred my face every time I thought of it. Water and earth. The ground beneath me trembled as immense power welled up from beneath the soil. The energy coursing through the earth built up to such proportions that I almost felt overwhelmed by it all. The earth cracked, and up from the opening came mud. My water and earth release had come together to form mud release. Seriously. All there was in front of me was a pile of mud. What the hell was mud release? Who the hell had ever heard of such a thing? I could use earth-style techniques that acted as mud. Who would want an entire Kekii Genkai of it? I wanted to hurt something, but who could I blame? There seemed to be something missing from my ability to recreate wood release, but I couldn't tell what. I sighed and dropped the slab of mud before focusing on the other difficult problem I had run into recently. Magnet release. It was very unique. I concentrated on the ground beneath me and snuffed out the fire, water, and lightning attributes. Next, I combined both my wind and earth-natured chakra before raising my hand. The ground began to tremble ever so slightly before a hand made of sand started to slowly form from the ground and grow as I raised mine. In just a moment, however, it crumbled and fell apart. I was not discouraged as I took out a bunch of kunai from my inventory and focused on my earth and wind chakra while also trying to apply a little bit of lightning-natured chakra to it as well. I picked up a kunai and injected the 2 chakra natures plus the supplemental lightning chakra into it before slowly lowering the weapon towards the other kunais on the ground. The kunai in my hand came close to the ones in the ground before finally making contact. Nothing happened. I furrowed my brows. They still don't attract. Magnet release. It was definitely something I wanted to create. To begin, I knew for a fact that it was possible to create certain Kekii Genkai and knew specifically that magnet release was one such bloodline limit. Or at least, one facet of it was. While reading up on Kekkei Genkai in order to recreate some, I had found some interesting information about magnet release. For one, there were actually two styles of magnet release, the sand-style magnet release and the cloud-style magnet release. The main difference between them was obvious. One came about from Sunagakure. The other from Kumogakure. But the differences were much more than that. The one-tailed beast of the hidden sand village was able to control fine particles of sand. From all the information I had read up on about it in addition to my own testing, I had found out that it couldn't control sand from earth release alone. Earth-natured chakra was designed to control large solid constructs and lacked the fine control necessary to effectively manipulate rocks much smaller than gravel. Therefore, the only way the sand raccoon could control such small particles was through magnet release chakra. Suna, being one of the weaker hidden villages due to their location, had wanted more military might, so they researched the abilities that manifested in each of Shikaku's hosts so that Nanjin Shiriki could replicate them. From what I had found, they had been more or less successful in producing individuals with magnet release, however it was actually somewhat limited. On the other hand, the Land of Lightning's magnet release had come about when the Yatsuki clan had made their home in the Valley of Clouds and Lightning for generations. The mountainous region had been subject to powerful magnetic fields, and over time their chakra had adapted to those magnetic fields and eventually developed into a new Kekkei Genkai. The cloud-style magnet release differed from sand-style and mainly due to the fact that it simulated magnetic forces more accurately. With my access to Konoha's informational archives, I had found out that Suna's magnet release superficially resembled real magnetic forces as the chakra fields generated by this bloodline granted direct control over any kind of mineral. However, due to the artificial nature of this bloodline, users had to learn through intense training how to attune their chakra to the unique atomic structure of each element of metal/mineral they wished to be able to manipulate. While all transition metals could fall under its influence, with the difficulty of learning multiple metals, the unsuitability of many metals to combat usage, and the relative scarcity of most metals, it was most appropriate to simply choose a particularly hard metal to specialize in, such as iron and gold. The third Kazekage had gotten famous through his use of iron sand. On the other hand, Lightning Country's Yatsuki clan could only control ferromagnetic metals, however, they did not need to attune to those metals through extensive training. Furthermore, they could also use their magnetic chakra fields to generate real non-chakra-based electrical currents through the principle of electromagnetic induction, which could then be incorporated into lightning release ninjutsu to greatly increase their speed and power. Even with all this knowledge, I had a hard time replicating their specific type of magnet release. Controlling stuff like sand or iron sand was great, but if I could obtain and develop the Yatsuki clan's magnet release abilities as well. With those self-encouraging thoughts, I continued my work and sat there in silence as I thought about what I could do to perfect my Kekkei Genkai. I took out a scroll and some ink before jotting down notes of my experiments. May 24th. It's obvious that elemental Kekkei Genkai have a strong biological component, however, whatever genetic processes drive their creation might be artificially replicated in an individual with high affinities for those elements. I paused and thought for a moment. I had eidetic memory and actually had no need to write stuff down, however. I simply liked doing so. It made me feel like I was actually doing something significant. Maybe I should get into research more often? Knowledge is harder to obtain than strength after all. I tapped my chin with my ink pen before a clone of mine popped and gave me more information about the ratio of energy he used, the timing of his fusion, and his execution. I jotted down those notes before sighing. Since Kekkei Genkai had such a biological component, I might have to meet up with Orochimaru at some point. One step at a time. I had been working on this project for some time and had only managed to produce small results. Rushing wouldn't help, so the only thing I could do now was wait and do more research into the subject. I'll be able to figure out something eventually. With that, I put my materials away and pulled out a different scroll that contained notes about my other project. Amanoto Kotachi, Heaven. When I'd taken a look at Minato's notes a few years back, I'd begun to work on improving my knowledge of spacetime seals. I wanted to create a technique based off of the flying right gene while not just making a copy. In order to do this, I decided to tackle Minato's technique from a different angle. That's when I thought of Amanoto Kotachi. What if instead of marking something and teleporting to the marked area, I could mark multiple things and swap places of the marked objects? I had initially thought of teleporting object to me instead of teleporting to objects, but I found that such an ability would have less battle function. Swapping the places of any two marked targets, however, could be applied in many more ways during battle. Of course, there was still a lot of research and practice that I had to do, especially since spacetime seals were quite dangerous. As long as I was in my ID, however, I think I'd be able to prevent the worst from happening. Besides, I felt like I needed to complete this technique. I had a foreboding feeling that I would need this ability in the near future. I wasn't going to take any chances. So, I continued my research. Chapter 17. Minato's POV. 2 days after Yoru's mission. I wish I had been there sooner. I looked down at the destroyed bridge and at Kakashi, who was staring off into the distance. Besides me stood Rin as she looked on ahead towards the rising sun. I had completed the mission. At a cost. I had lost a comrade and a student, but more importantly, I had failed to save someone close to me. With that, I closed my eyes for a moment, standing still as the wind rustled my hair, before I opened them. Kakashi, Rin, let's go home. Our mission is complete. Kakashi stood in silence for a moment before nodding and appearing next to me. His expression was empty and devoid of emotion, but I knew that he was going through mental torment. But worse than him. I looked towards Rin, whose expression was serene, yet I could tell she was in the most pain. And they had been getting closer too. I placed a hand in both their shoulders before concentrating on my other beacons. I had left plenty of my Hiraishin marks in and around certain places, few of which were located near Konoha. With that, I quickly located its signal and vanished from my spot. We appeared right next to the entrance of the village and walked through Konoha's gates after checking with the guards. I looked towards my two students before commenting, "You two should get some rest. I'll go notify the Hokage that our mission has been completed." Without words, they nodded and walked off, leaving me alone to make my way towards the Hokage's office. At least for now, the war will be mostly over. With the losses Rock Country had suffered in addition to the loss of their major supply line, among others, they would have no choice but to withdraw from the war. It would take a few more years before it would be completely over, so I would have to keep vigilant for now. And make sure that I don't lose another one of them. I halted my steps and looked ahead at the Hokage building before entering inside. I walked through the halls and up the steps of the building before stopping in front of the door to the Hokage's office. I stood there for a moment before releasing a breath and knocking on the door. "Enter." I nodded and opened the door before closing it behind me as I entered. I watched as the Hokage looked at the papers in his hands with an expression of immense gravity. His face was marred with a disturbed frown as he read and flipped through the papers before he sighed and placed them down. He looked up from his papers before finally noticing who I was. As soon as he did, his expression became somewhat more lax but retained its severity due to the subject that he knew I was here to discuss. "Minato, to be back this early, I take it that your mission went well?" "Yes, Lord Hokage," I said with a short bow. However, I paused for a moment before releasing another breath. My student, Obito Uchiha, died in combat, and as a parting gift he granted Kakashi Hatake his Sharingan. There was silence at that statement as the Hokage leaned back into his chair. He looked up to the ceiling and closed his eyes for a moment before sighing, "I'm sorry for your loss." I shook my head. It was my fault I didn't make it in time. I will have to live with this failure. The Hokage looked at me before commenting, "There's no point in dwelling on what you could have done, but instead you should focus on what you can do better next time." I nodded my head in agreement. I will schedule a memorial service in a couple weeks for those who gave their life for the future of this village. Your student deserves to be honored as the hero he was. The Hokage began, before exhaustion creeped into his tone. But besides that, thank you for giving me another issue to deal with. A non-Uchiha with the Sharingan won't go over well with the Uchiha clan. I managed to crack a half-hearted smile. There's nothing I could have done regardless, it was Obito's parting gift. Besides, I believe that you can convince Fugaku to have his clan let it go, he's quite reasonable. Let's hope so. Hiruzen stated before he looked back down at his papers and a grimace reformed on his face. I raised a brow. May I ask what's wrong, Lord Hokage? No, it's just... The Hokage flipped through his papers once more before sighing in exhaustion. He seemed to be doing that more often. He looked back at his papers before explaining. Recently there have been a few of our shinobi who have gone missing. While that normally would not have brought about any of my suspicion due to our current state of war, all the missing individuals shared something in common. His eyes narrowed. They all had bloodline limits. I furrowed my brows. Do you think this is an enemy attempt at producing more bloodlines within their village? It wasn't unheard of at all and was something that unfortunately occurred quite frequently. Hiruzen slowly shook his head. I initially thought the same, except that the situation was much more complex than I had imagined. He brought up one of the papers to eye level before continuing. The disappearances had prompted me to send out a few groups to investigate, and that was when I was made aware of secret laboratories that experimented with the Chimera technique. I thought about that for a moment. Chimera technique? The old Hokage nodded. I suppose you'll have to deal with it in the future, so I suppose I should tell you now. I paused at that statement. Deal with it in the future? The Hokage continued. My shinobi had found some disturbing laboratories around Fire Country many years ago. It was there that they found not only the remains of some of our missing personnel, but also the corpses of grotesque beasts. He tapped his desk as he looked at the papers. From all the findings and research papers that could be gathered in those labs, it was concluded that someone had been experimenting with a technique that would grant them the Kekkei Genkai of other ninja by fusing their bodies. This, I thought in seriousness. Have you found any leads as to who is responsible? And what of the findings? To be honest, this sounded like something Orochimaru would do, but I knew that even he wouldn't use Konoha shinobi for his experiments. Besides, last I heard he had been too busy playing with Yoru's healing seal for his research. The Hokage rubbed his brows. At that time, I had already declared the technique a kenjutsu and had destroyed most of its information. Recently, however, another laboratory was discovered with experiments of the same technique. It appeared to me that the same individual who had been responsible for the disappearances many years ago was still scourging while we had been preoccupied with the war. The Hokage sighed in exhaustion before continuing. I had all the material collected and allowed Orochimaru to do an autopsy on the deceased shinobi and the abominations that were found in this most recent lab. As for who was responsible, here he paused. An individual by the name of Hirako, currently a missing nin of Konoha. Hirako? The name rung a very dull bell in my mind. Where have I heard that name mentioned before? At any rate, Hiruzen continued. I've been having trouble locating him, and with the war still ongoing, I can't afford to divert any more attention. The best I can do is exercise more caution when my shinobi are out in the field. Make sure you do the same. I suppose this was one of those situations you simply couldn't do much about, not until all the other situations were dealt with. I will. I replied. The Hokage then gathered the papers in a beat pile and placed them to the side before interlacing his fingers as he stared at me. The mood turned oddly serious as he asked, Before you go, I would like to ask that you humor me with this question of mine. I blinked before nodding. All right. The old man then asked. Tell me, what do you believe is the Hokage's duty? I halted at that question. My mind traveled back to just yesterday. The day I had failed to protect my student. I believe that the duty of the Hokage is to keep Konoha safe, lead it to prosperity, and always keep its best interests at heart, but most importantly. I looked down and gripped my fist. The Hokage's duty is to cherish, guide, and protect its future generation, no matter the cost. The Hokage hummed at that before a smile made its way onto his face. Interesting, I like your answer. You may leave if you wish. I nodded and bowed. Thank you, Lord Hokage. And with that, I left the room. I made my way down and out of the Hokage's building before teleporting to my house. I placed my hand on the security pad before I was allowed access to the house. Numerous thoughts went through my mind as I made my way to the living room. Welcome home, Papa. I paused and looked at the owner of the voice before smiling. I'm glad to be home, Mito. She smiled brightly in reply before a floating mass of water, in the shape of a teddy bear, suddenly appeared in front of her face. Her eyes brightened as she reached out and squeezed the water bear in her embrace. I take it your mission went well? An all too familiar voice blandly asked. I looked at Yoru, who was behind my daughter and was creating more water animals for my daughter to play with. At his question, however, I paused for a moment. We were able to complete the objective, but we suffered a casualty. Yoru halted his movements before staring at me. The way you say that, what happened? I sat down on the couch. We lost Obito. I was met with silence. Yoru idly sat on the ground and maneuvered his water creations as he played with Mito, his eyes somewhat unfocused. It was only after a while that he finally spoke. I see. I looked at him carefully. I couldn't read him. He rarely displayed emotion, making it impossible to understand what was going on in his mind most of the time. I assumed that he was feeling something at this moment though. I just couldn't tell what. In a few days, we'll have a memorial for him and those who died in this war. I stated, managing to grab his attention. I was hoping I might see you there. The boy nodded. Of course. And with that, we lapsed into another round of silence. Man, he makes things awkward. Yoru, gamer. Yoru's POV. I walked out of Minato's home. I paused in my step as I tried to figure out which direction I wanted to go before I decided I didn't really care too much. So, I walked. And then, I sighed. Can't believe you got yourself killed. It felt kind of weird to me. I had not suffered the loss of anyone even somewhat close to me during the course of this war, yet just as it was about to end. Granted, we weren't that close. I would never admit it even if we were. He definitely made his girl upset too, even after all I taught him. If anything, I had thought that I would be the first to hit the bucket in this war from the number of suicidal missions I undertook. Actually, I did die, for a short moment, not too long ago. However, I'm still alive now. With that, I continued my walk. My feet guided me to wherever they decided to go as I traversed through the village, the activities a blur behind me. And then, I stopped. I looked in front of me, realizing that I had arrived at the training grounds that Team Minato frequented. And I wasn't alone. Up ahead was the back of Rin's form as she stared off into the distance, the melancholy emanating from her holy salient. There was a slight breeze that rustled through us and made her hair wave through the wind. There was a simple silence between us for a while and I wondered if I should leave. You know. She suddenly began. While he was often stubborn, argued with Kakashi, and more often than not got himself into trouble, he was also compassionate, dedicated and hardworking. She stood there in silence for a moment as a whirlwind of emotions passed through her. At that time, when he was dying, I couldn't do anything but stay by his side. After that, Kakashi was the one to save me and again I couldn't do anything. And when we were outnumbered and surrounded by the enemy, it was my teacher who came to save me, and again I was useless. She then paused before turning around. But in the end, there's nothing I can do about what's already happened, and I can't remain sad forever because I know Obito would want us all to smile. Saying so, she beamed at me. That's why I'll simply try harder to never be a burden and to help the best I can. I looked at her blandly. I didn't know what to say or do. So, I simply remained silent. I'm sorry if I came off a little intense. Rin started while scratching her cheek. That was more for me, but I hope you didn't mind. I shook my head. Is that so? Then I'm glad. She said with a smile once more before turning back. It's about time I get back to my place, so I'll head out. She then slightly turned her head towards me. Thanks for listening, Yoru. With her final words, she quickly vanished from view. I stared at the direction she vanished to before continuing my walk. However, this time, I had a destination in mind. Obito's grandmother would come to know about this, but the thought of having to deliver this news to her. I shook my head before continuing my walk towards the Uchiha clan district. As I arrived closer to my destination, however, I halted my steps and furrowed my brows. I can't sense her chakra anywhere inside the compound. The woman was old and rarely went out, so it was odd to not feel her specific signature inside. I figured that she might have simply gone out shopping or something, so I decided to simply meet her at her home and wait for her to come back. With that thought, I moved closer to the gates before the guards came into view. One of them looked my way and paused for a moment before a smile made its way on his face. Yo! How's it going, Yoru? Haruki. I began. Like usual, I suppose. A slight frown made its way onto his face. You sure? You sound more dead than usual, and I didn't think that was possible. I'm just thinking about some things is all. He didn't seem 100% convinced, but he smiled regardless. Well, don't let it bring you down, kiddo. He then motioned to his partner to open the gate before turning back to me. Well, enjoy your visit. I nodded in thanks before heading into the clan compound and making my way towards Obito's home. Some people spared me a glance before looking away, others gave me a nod of acknowledgement to which I returned, and the rest didn't bother to look my way. It all didn't matter as I eventually arrived at the relatively small apartment that Obito lived in with his grandmother. I couldn't sense her chakra inside, so I simply leaned against the side of the door for a while. Hey, you! I lifted my head and turned towards the sound of the voice, noting a woman who was making her way towards me. As she saw my face, however, she paused. Yoru? I looked at her. I didn't know who she was, but it didn't surprise me that she knew of me since I frequented this area a decent amount and my face was somewhat well known. With this in mind, I nodded. She looked behind me at the apartment before she sighed. If you're waiting for the owner of the house, then you'll be waiting here forever. I stilled. She looked back towards me and continued. Last night, the woman who owned this home died of age-related complications. She then shook her head. She lived through 3 wars till the ripe old age of 70, I'd say she lived a full life. My mind, however, was elsewhere. However, she continued in thought. I heard she had a grandson that she had been taking care of. Poor kid will be upset when he finds Dash. Thank you for the information. I said simply before walking away. Ah, okay. I replied with a nod once more and continued my walk. Yet, I couldn't help but think. Was life really so fragile? Not only had Obito died during his mission, but even his grandmother had passed away as well, probably around the same time. I suppose it wasn't unexpected for her to die due to her age, but still. It made me wonder about myself. Would I die? Of old age at least, I already knew I could technically die in battle. I mean, I knew that I was aging, but would I simply stop doing so at a certain point? Did Gamer's body prevent me from dying of old age? These were some of the questions that came to mind, however dwelling on them seemed to be meaningless. This was something only time would tell. Yoru, gamer. The drizzle of water pouring down from the overcast sky paralleled the depressing emotional atmosphere of the surroundings. The Third Great Shinobi War had drastically decreased in intensity with the succession of Minato's mission at Canopy Bridge, IWA having slowly begun to back off. Despite this, I could sense fiddling joy around me despite this fact as the tombs of those lost in the war stood erect in front of my view. In accordance with the funeral proceedings, I wore a black robe and stood beside Minato and the rest of his team as we silently paid our respects with our eyes closed. I retracted the zone of my empathy as the overabundance of depression and desolation became unpleasant and simply stood still for as long as the proceedings required. In about a few hours, the funeral proceedings were completed and the cemetery began to empty as the individuals went on with their lives. Thank you for being here, Yoru. Minato stated as he opened his eyes and looked towards me. I nodded my head. Rin waved at me with a smile, which I acknowledged, while Kakashi stood stock still, his gaze lingering on a tombstone in particular. I didn't need to follow his line of sight to know where he was looking at. I'll be going home. You all are welcome to stop by. Minato stated as he looked between us. While Rin immediately nodded in agreement, Kakashi waited for a while before muttering, "Sure." A nearly imperceptible sigh made its way out of Minato's lips before he turned towards me. And you? I raised my head slightly and looked to my right where Itachi stood stationary, the rest of his clan having already departed. I'll spend my day at Itachi Place. Minato smiled, then that's fine. He then looked towards Rin and Kakashi, come on, let's go. Minato then immediately vanished followed by Rin soon after. Kakashi looked ahead for a while longer before following after them. I looked at the area they had previously occupied before turning back towards Itachi, noting that Orochimaru now stood beside him. With a slightly raised brow, I made my way over to them. Ah, Yoru. A pleasure to see you here. The pale-skinned man stated with an elongated grin. I somehow don't feel the same. His grin somehow grew even wider, you've never visited my lab. Trust me when I tell you that the technique you gave me is much more fascinating than I could ever dream of. I believe that you will find it interesting, so do consider paying me a visit. I turned my gaze up towards him. I gave it to as payment for obtaining data on my genetic information, something you haven't told me much about. His eyes gleamed as he licked his lips. To tell the truth, your DNA is spectacular, to say the least. If you ever decide to come over, I'll provide you with all the data I have unearthed from your... His eyes eagerly scanned my body, causing my body to slightly shiver. Marvelous genetic material. And I think we're done here. I looked to Itachi, who had been giving me questioning looks for some time now, and grabbed his shoulder. I'll get back to you on that. I stated to Orochimaru before using the body flicker. That man had serious problems. How you could stand being next to him for a prolonged period of time is unknown to me. I told Itachi as we arrived in front of the gate to his clan compound. He raised a brow in return as we walked through the gate. You two seemed quite close to me. An odd twitching overcame my right eye. Believe me, if I didn't need him for something important, I would do my best not to interact with him. With a tilt of his head, Itachi asked me, your DNA? Yeah. I replied with a nod. I'm trying to figure out what more my body can do. Itachi blinked in puzzlement. You have a bloodline limit? Something like that. He seemed curious but decided not to ask as we approached his home. We approached the door to his house before he opened it and brought me inside. Big brother. A young voice exclaimed, following which enthusiastic footsteps made their way in our direction. Up in front of us appeared the form of a toddler with black hair and onyx eyes which gleamed as they looked towards Itachi. Sasuke. The boy smiled brightly and ran towards Itachi as quickly as his little feet could carry him. And then he tripped. In a burst of wind, Itachi appeared beside Sasuke and grabbed onto the scruff of his clothing before his face made intimate contact with the hardwood floor. This is why mother tells you not to run in the house. Itachi stated with a sigh before pulling Sasuke upright. Sasuke gave him a sour look at that, causing Itachi to smile helplessly. Come on, don't look at me like that. We tell you these things for your own safety. Your big brother is right, you know, we wouldn't want you to get hurt. The angelic voice of Makoto suddenly sounded out from in front of us. Mother! Itachi said as he stood up while patting his little brother's head. Sasuke smiled once more and wobbled towards her, causing the woman to smile and pick him up. She then looked towards both Itachi and me before asking, Are any of you hungry? I could make something for the both of you if you would like. I think we are F-Amished and we would love to help you prepare. I finished for Itachi before he could say anything else. Oh? The beautiful woman stated, placing a hand over her mouth, since you're asking so kindly, I don't really have a choice, do I? She said with a chuckle. Well, if you don't mind, help me prepare some of the vegetables in the kitchen. It would be my pleasure. I stated, following which, with that glowing smile on her face, Makoto made her way back into the kitchen. There was an awkward silence between me and Itachi following that as I looked ahead. Your mom's nice, you know? The room suddenly felt colder and I slowly rotated my head towards Itachi. His eyes were crimson and had 3 tomo in each of them as he narrowed them straight at me. I coughed awkwardly for a moment. Well, those vegetables aren't going to prepare themselves, you know, let's go help her. While his Sharingan disappeared, his glare did not lessen, but he nodded nonetheless and made his way into the kitchen. I scratched the back of my head with a smile and followed him inside the kitchen where his mother was watching us warmly. With Sasuke tied around her back, she laid out the produce, a cutting board, a large bowl and a knife before Itachi and me before explaining, chop them up finely, place the onions, peppers, and tomatoes in the bowl, the garlic to the side, and make sure not to hurt yourself. Itachi gave his mom an odd look. Mother, we are involved in much more dangerous activities during our missions. Era? Then you won't heed my warning, I suppose? She asked with a hand on her face. Well, that's not really what I mean. Come on, Itachi, you should listen to your mom. She's only saying this to keep you safe. Immediately, he whipped his head towards me, his Sharingan blazing and the tomo in his eyes spinning wildly. I immediately turned my head away from him and looked in front of me at the cooking board, somehow finding it quite interesting at this moment. Was it mahogany? Makoto chuckled in amusement before asking, Will you two be alright? Yeah. I said, grabbing the kitchen knife by its hilt and twirling it around for a moment before stopping and raising it to eye level, the blade glistening from the kitchen light. I've cooked plenty of times on my own or for my teacher. I think I have some skill in the art. Then I expect the best from you. Make sure you pay close attention, Itachi. She said before lighting up the stove and placing a pot of water on it. I will step out for a moment, but in the meantime, I'll let this heat up. Saying so, she covered the pot and stepped out of the kitchen. Another round of awkward silence permeated the atmosphere between Itachi and I as I could feel his eyes boring into my skull while I pretended not to notice. Itachi then came closer and stood to the right of me in front of the other cooking board, yet his gaze still lingered on me. I felt a slight twitch in my right eye before I picked up and inspected a tomato. I carefully placed it down before slowly cutting it vertically. Afterwards, I rotated it 90 degrees and did so once more, providing me with long strips of tomato which I again began to slowly cut into smaller chunks. How long do you plan on staring at me like that? I asked as I still sensed Itachi's piercing gaze on my skin. Somehow, I could feel his eyes narrow even further. Who knows? I'm merely following the instructions laid out by my mother. I rolled my eyes. Come on, it's all in good fun. Your mom is a strong, grown, beautiful woman. She easily brushes me off anyway. Saying so, I grabbed an onion next and tossed it in midair before positioning my knife. My perception of time slowed with accelerated analysis, and as the onion came to my eye level, I moved. I whipped out my right hand and rapidly skinned the onion with the kitchen knife. With my perception of time lowered, the pieces of skin seemed to float in mid-air with the onion still at around my eye level. I didn't let that distract me, however, and I moved once more. To any ordinary individual, it would have looked like my hand moved in an instant, and to most shinobi, my hands would have only registered as a blur, and they moved at incredible speeds. With every stroke, my kitchen knife made contact with the onion at precise angles. First, I cut the onion completely vertically, then I immediately cut it horizontally. Then, as it was barely below my eye level at this point, I cut it into smaller pieces even still. My perception returned to normal, and in my vision, the perfectly diced onion fell into the large bowl, not a single one out of place. With a light smile, I turned to look towards Itachi only to notice that his Sharingan was still active and his eyes were rapidly twitching as if to process information. In a moment he closed his eyes before they opened in honed focus. His eyes glowing red, he grabbed an onion and tossed it up before his arm blurred. In but a millisecond, he stopped and the onion landed into the bowl with perfectly sliced shapes. Just like mine. My right eye twitched, you didn't. He gave me a look bursting with naive innocence, yet I could detect the disguised smug look underneath. TCH. I stated and grabbed multiple peppers on the side before working my knife once more. I tossed them all up at once and my right hand blurred before the peppers split apart in midair and landed on my board in neat shapes. I looked to my side only to notice that Itachi had copied my movements precisely as I had been doing them. My lips twitched as I smiled. Do you really want to play this game now, Itachi? Whatever do you mean? He asked with a tilt of his head. I'm merely following my mother's instructions. Oh? I said as my hand tightly gripped the hilt of the knife before I tossed up an assortment of onions, tomatoes, peppers, and garlic. They were launched in such a way that the first three would perfectly land in the bowl while the last one would land comfortably on my cutting board. Accelerated analysis. Deconstructive analysis. I used these two abilities in conjunction as my concentration peaked to insurmountable levels. Through my glowing silver eyes, time seemed to slow down and I could see small red areas of the fruits and vegetables in the air. I narrowed my eyes and blurred my right hand as I began to chop up the produce. Suddenly, my eyes sharpened. I turned to my right for a brief moment only to see that Itachi's eyes were on me as well. Poof. Without looking, I switched the hand wielding the knife incredibly fast and stared right back at Itachi as I continued to cut the vegetables that were in midair. With my eidetic memory and my incredible processing capabilities courtesy of accelerated analysis, I knew and remembered the angle, magnitude, and direction with which the vegetables would fall. I likewise calculated how those vector quantities would change in response to my movements, so I did not even need to look in order to cut the vegetables in the precise manner I wanted. With that, Itachi and I locked eyes as we began to cut all the necessary fruits and vegetables that Makoto had left out for us. Our hands blurred faster and faster as we perfectly cut up more and more of the produce before our knives began to intermingle and clash briefly against each other. Sparks began to fly as we turned our bodies and blurred our knives at each other while also making sure to perfectly slice the food. With eyes narrowed, we continued this dance of blades for a long while after, the wind whipping up from the speed of our movements. Before we stopped. With a clang, our kitchen knives clashed against each other once more. Time seemed to have halted at that moment before the chopped-up provisions suddenly fell. Those that needed to go into bowls landed in the bowls while those that had to go on the side of the cutting board landed perfectly on their position. Suddenly, a ding sounded out. Ah! I came back just in time. Makoto stayed as she suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway, Sasuke still attached to her back. She ignored me and Itachi whose knives were still interlocked and walked to the pot before opening the lid. A cloud of steam emerged which quickly dissipated before she spoke. Now I can finally begin. She paused. Both Itachi and I turned to look at her, immediately noting that Makoto was looking in our direction. Before we could even speak, however. Oh. You two did wonderful. She explained as she grabbed the bowl of the chopped plants and our cutting board of garlic before placing it beside her. I looked back at Itachi who blinked in reply and retracted his knife before placing it on the counter. I soon followed suit before I felt a vision on my back and I slowly turned around only to witness Makoto narrowing her eyes at me. "Hey Yoru." I was instantly on guard. Itachi started at dash. "Do your eyes usually glow?" she asked before relaxing her vision. "They look so adorable." I paused and smiled despite myself before deactivating deconstructive analysis. "Well, they tend to shine in front of beautiful angels." "Oh my," she chuckled in response. "Well, thank you too for your help. Just rest, for now. I'll prepare something in a moment. Thank you for your hospitality," I said with a short bow before I felt a chilling vision penetrating my back. I turned around, noting an odd miasma appearing around Itachi as his eyes shined red, his Sharingan activated in full. I twitched a smile regardless. "Why do you seem so upset, Itachi?" I asked, placing an arm on his shoulder and walking out of the kitchen. "If you're upset that this competition was a tie, don't be. Someday you might beat me." He looked me straight in the eye with his bloodline activated. "If you keep hitting on my mom, one of these days you'll find your entire clan dead." I blinked. Wow, that's pretty fucked, but I don't have a clan. Though if I did, I had this odd feeling that he'd do it. Weird. "Oof," he said, deactivating his Sharingan and taking his seat on the tatami floor in front of the dining room table. As a result, I sat across from him in a Seiza position. "Come on, don't look at me like that. It's not my fault your mom is so gordash." He stared at me hard. I sighed and raised my hands in placation. Fine, I'll stop talking about your mom," I said. "Instead, I wouldn't mind knowing what you and Orochimaru were talking about." The mood suddenly became depressive. I knew he was a pain to talk to, but I didn't think it was this bad, I stated. Itachi shook his head in disconfirmation. "No, it wasn't something like that." He then lightly sighed. "I just asked him a question that had been on my mind for a while, but..." I leaned my cheek on my left arm. "I'm not surprised." He probably responded with something dreary and depressing. He nodded. "The Third Great Shinobi War is at its low point, however, at what cost? Did we really even win? So many individuals lost their lives, yet still conflict is perpetuating throughout the shinobi world. The funeral today just got me thinking about life in general and its purpose." "There is none," I said, before immediately following up, "or that's what Orochimaru probably said." Itachi blinked and nodded his head. I sighed. "Yeah, he seems like the guy to give you that answer. I couldn't tell you since I'm only a year and a half older than you, but who knows? You'll come up with your own answer one day." I paused before shaking my head. There's no point in talking about something so bleak. It just ruins the mood. "I suppose so," Itachi said with a smile. However, internally I sighed. I could sense that he definitely wasn't in the mood for smiling. I raised my head from my hand before I paused as a familiar chakra signature appeared behind the front door. I looked to Itachi, who seemed to be lost in thought, and stated with a smile, "It looks like your girlfriend is here." His expression changed. "What?" Before he could ask further, a knock sounded from the front door. "Itachi! May you please get that?" Makoto yelled from the kitchen. "Yes, mother," he stated before looking at me, standing up, walking to the door, and opening it. "Ah, Itachi," a cheerful voice stated. "Sorry for intruding, but I saw you look down earlier, so I thought I would drop by." "Izumi," he said quietly, though I could tell he was happier than he let on. "Please come in." "Thank you," she said before I heard their footsteps approach the living room area where I was staying. In but a moment they appeared in view, which caused Izumi to pause as she saw me before she smiled. "I didn't think I'd see you here before me." "It's good to see you, Yoru." "Likewise," I replied. "Little Izumi." Makoto's voice sounded as she made her entrance, delight clearly expressed in her voice. "I'm glad you came over," She continued after embracing Izumi and motioning her towards the tatami mat. Please take a seat. Lunch will be out in just a moment. Thank you. Izumi said before she plopped down next to Itachi with a smile on her face before her face lit up in remembrance. I remember that I got you something that I knew you'd like, hold on a sec. Saying so, she opened the bag she was carrying on her side before taking out a small case. With my enhanced sense of smell, I could tell that it was something sweet and was proven correct when Izumi opened it, revealing many sticks of dumplings. I know you have a sweet tooth, so I figured I would get you something. She trailed off as she noticed the intense look of desire in Itachi's eyes as he stared at the dumplings. His eyes actually began to morph into the Sharingan as if to imprint the food into the deepest recesses of his mind. Izumi smiled awkwardly. Well, I think we should wait till after we eat the lunch your mother oh so graciously prepared. Don't you think? Itachi frowned and seemed to struggle internally for a moment before he nodded. I suppose they can wait. Izumi smiled playfully and softly leaned her head on his shoulder, to which an imperceptible smile made its way on Itachi's lips. I watched them intently as they vanished into their own world, wondering about my own non-existent love life. Women are sometimes a pain though. I would know seeing as I'd lived with one for over 5 years now. I really couldn't imagine having to live with one for the rest of my life. Oh well, I was only 9 so this was quite irrelevant to me at this point anyway, but still. How did Itachi get one before me? I mean, I suppose it had to do with the fact that I didn't know many individuals my age, to begin with. But I was more handsome than he was, in my humble opinion. And definitely more powerful, that was a fact. Maybe I should go out more? Nah, unnecessary human interaction was a pain to deal with. Besides, Itachi was only slightly less of a recluse than I was and had a cute girl. How the hell did that happen? Well, they did meet in the academy. Maybe I should go there one day. Food is ready. Makoto exclaimed from the kitchen before she came out with food in hand. Let me help you. I said as I got up and helped her set down the food along with the rest that she had left in the kitchen. Ah, thank you. You're such a lifesaver. I nodded my head. Of course. I noticed, however, that Itachi gave me an odd and suspicious look at my interaction with Makoto, causing me to smirk. Now then. Makoto began, clapping her hands together. I'm sure you're all famished so don't hold back. Izumi smiled before clapping her hands together and closing her eyes. Thank you for the meal. Thank you for the meal. The rest of us followed suit. Makoto then reached behind herself and pulled out Sasuke from her back before placing him on her lap. Here you go. Now you can eat with mommy. Sasuke pouted slightly, but I wanted to eat with big brother. Ah, he's too cute. Izumi squealed before looking at Sasuke with glistening eyes. Why don't you sit next to your big sister here? Sasuke gave her a dull look before turning his head away and dismissing her as if she was air. Izumi blanked. Oh dear. Makoto began, placing a hand on her cheek. He doesn't seem to like you that much, does he? Lightning seemed to tear through her heart as she leaned back in shock. The older woman grinned playfully in response to which Itachi interjected, we should probably eat before the food gets cold. You're right, dear. Makoto stated before securing Sasuke in place and grabbing onto her chopsticks. She then looked at the rest of us. Well, don't wait for me, dig in. I turned my gaze from her and looked at the spread before me before grabbing my disposable chopsticks and breaking them apart. My gaze hovered over the food before concentrating on a dish ahead of me that had caught my attention. Takoyaki. I wasted no time in moving my chopsticks towards the multiple delicious octopus balls. They inched closer and closer as my anticipation built up. However, just as I was a centimeter away, a different pair of chopsticks suddenly appeared and took the takoyaki ball that I had been aiming for. I slowly rolled my eyeballs upwards to look at the culprit who was slowly chewing the food he had stolen from me with a lazy look. My eyes narrowed. My hand zoomed forward with insane velocity, its aim positioned towards the takoyaki. Just as my chopsticks clamped onto the divine goodness of octopus balls, another pair of chopsticks clamped onto mine, preventing me from moving it. The air coagulated. Itachi, what is the meaning of this? He tilted his head innocently. The meaning, you say? I'm merely digging in as my mother instructed. Izumi looked between Itachi and me before turning her gaze towards Makoto. Mrs. Makoto, what's going on? She sighed. They tend to turn a lot of things into competitions. Should we stop them? She asked in wonder. Let them be. Makoto said as she began to feed Sasuke. They're just children after all. Go big Brovker. Hey now. Don't talk with your mouth full. The lady of the house stated reproachfully. My mind was brought back to its current predicament as Itachi began to exert pressure on his chopsticks, the force of which threatened to crack mine own. I sharpened my gaze and activated deconstructive analysis, causing my eyes to glow. With my incredible dexterity, I maneuvered one of my chopsticks back before shooting it forward, aiming it at the weak spot of Itachi's own utensils. It cracked, causing Itachi's eyes to widen, which provided me with a large enough window of opportunity to secure the octopus ball with my wooden sticks. I wasted no time in retrieving the objecting before ingesting it with glee, my gaze filling over as I looked at Itachi imperiously. Itachi looked down at his broken chopsticks for a moment before he lifted his head, his Sharingan activated. You're going to pay for that. I raised a brow and swallowed my food before replying, doubtful. With that, Itachi procured another pair of chopsticks before immediately motioning his utensil-holding hand forward. My eyes widened as I saw that they were aimed toward any beloved takoyaki, so I dashed forward as well. Itachi and I both picked up a takoyaki ball before bringing it towards our mouth and eating it. I furrowed my brows before dashing forward once more and procuring another one, but no sooner did Itachi do the same. I looked at him. He looked at me. And we moved. With immense speeds, we both continued to battle over the takoyaki, taking and eating as many as we could as fast as we could. Our hands blurred as the large stack of delicious balls of goodness started to slowly decrease in size before in a few moments the plate became empty. Itachi and I paused as we looked at each other before our gaze slowly traveled towards the rice balls. With one more look at each other, we hurried to procure the fluffy carb-filled balls as we competed with each other. The large bowl of rice started to rapidly deflate in size before it too became empty. Next, fish. We moved in unison as we attacked the grilled fish with ferocity, causing it to disappear in but a few moments as well. Spring rolls. It didn't take long before those disappeared into my digestive system either. Egg rolls. Those disappeared in a moment. Mixed vegetables. Gone. Kale-wrapped beef. Was there even a need to say? As Itachi and I competed, I idly noted that Makoto looked at us in amusement as she ate deservedly, while Izumi looked at Itachi and me as if we were foreign animals while absent-mindedly eating her food. Sasuke was jumping around in excitement. Let's go, Itachi and I. The food around the table slowly disappeared before all that was left was the pot of hot green tea. At this junction, Itachi and I came to a compromise as we sat down calmly, our stomachs inflated. So, how was it? Makoto asked as she looked between the two of us. It was delicious, thanks mother. Anything touched by your hands is divine. Itachi's eyes twitched as he glared at me, causing me to slightly smirk. Hi. She said with a smile before grabbing the teapot and serving tea to all the table occupants. Izumi still had a blank look on her face while Sasuke looked at Itachi in awe. Big brother, you're so awesome. Itachi smiled before grabbing his cup. Wait. Izumi stated before bringing out her case of sweets and placing it on the table. I suppose that since we are now done eating, a little dessert wouldn't hurt. Saying so, she opened the case, bringing to view the multiple sticks of dango that she had procured. Seeing Itachi's intense look, she shook her head. No. We'll each get the same amount. He reluctantly nodded. Ah, thank you so much, little Izumi. Makoto stayed as she brought the girl into her bosom. She then whispered, I can't wait till you're my daughter. Of course, with my enhanced hearing, I could easily pick it up. The poor young girl slightly flushed red from the statement, causing Makoto to smile. Well, are you going to pass them around? I asked the brown-haired girl, who startled herself awake. All right. She said before passing out the snacks around and smiling. Thank you. I said before closing my eyes, quietly eating the snack. Suddenly, I whipped out my hand and caught onto a wrist before opening one eye as I chewed the food. With a gulp, I simply stated, not today. Itachi narrowed his eyes at me before retracting his hand, after which I quickly finished off the dango and gulped down the tea. Thank you for the meal, Lady Makoto. I stated before turning to Izumi. And thank you for the snack. Of course. The older woman said with a smile. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Same. Izumi followed up gleefully. I nodded my head and stood up. I can help with clearing up the place if you want. Makoto looked over the large table of empty dishes and chuckled, I would appreciate that. I looked towards Itachi and motioned at him with my head, to which he responded with a nod. With that, we began to clear up the table and brought everything to the kitchen before washing them. The sink wasn't too large and only had one faucet, but with my water manipulation, I was able to clean up the dishes with Itachi. We worked in silence as we cleared everything up, and I could sense that his emotions were much calmer than before. In a little bit, we were able to clear out all the dishes that had been used, so we made our way back towards the dining room. There, Makoto cradled a drowsy Sasuke, so she stood up. I'll refuse myself for some time, the rest of you can keep each other company. Itachi looked at the before asking, Mother, I haven't seen father since earlier, could he be at a meeting? She replied with a smile. A lot of things have been going on, so he'll be out for a much longer time. Itachi nodded. I see. With that, the Uchiha mistress made her way out of the dining room, leaving the three of us here to interact. It wasn't too bad, as we simply talked about whatever came to mind, from Izumi and me making fun of Itachi's love for sweets, to me making fun of their relationship, and to them trying to make fun of me for something. Too bad the only trait of mine that was worth making fun of was a well-kept secret. No one will ever find out about my infatuation with cute things. Izumi was a dear, so there really wasn't anything I could say about her personally. With that, time began to pass quickly as we talked amongst ourselves, before it eventually became dark. I looked outside, noting the beautiful full moon, before standing up. Thank you for having me over, however, it is getting kind of late. Itachi nodded, thank you for coming over. Izumi interjected with a grin, he forgot to say that he enjoys your company and wishes you would come over more often. Itachi gave her a sour look while I smiled lightly. We can make arrangements for that another time. For now, I'll head back home. Itachi stood up and nodded before walking me towards the door. I'll see you another time, he stated. And I simply replied likewise. So, I walked away from his house and down the road. After a few moments, I paused and looked up to the starlit skies. There were a lot of things I wanted to do, and my mind was constantly thinking of a variety of things, however. Living in the moment, it's not too bad. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.